All right, what do we have? 22 people on.
22, I would say we're in
let's get
4
started.
after.
Let's get started. So I'll kick us off. Welcome everyone to our meetup for November. This is a joint meetup of the Agile Groupies user group meetup and the Daytona Devs meetup. And today we will be hearing about unlocking the secrets of BDD and Robot Framework. And from Kyle Griffin, Arete will introduce that for us. Kyle, 25 years experience as a teacher, process improvement specialist, and a programmer and architect. I'm excited that he's been teaching and implementing a collaborative practice that we like to call Agile, but before Agile was even written as a manifesto, the XP or extreme programming techniques. So I'm excited for that because that's where I started hearing about Agile as well. So I relate to the extreme programming concepts, and I'm excited that you have that history as well. So I know you've been working as a coach, trainer, mentor in the last 10 years, lead programmer as well. And you are going to help lead us through more of a, hopefully a hands-on approach as well as a demo of BDD and Robot Framework. So Kyle, let me know if you need anything, or we've got both Tom Malash and Greg Campo are here as co-hosts and hosts to help make things happen for you. So we are ready to get started. So thank you, Kyle.
Thank you. Welcome. And let's try this. Is this nice and visible to everyone? Sorry, I've got all the screens and I'm trying to make sure that I can see something of the people while I'm doing the screens. On the other hand, I still haven't figured out how to actually track chat very well. So, okay, I can do that maybe.
Well, yeah.
With lots of screens. If something happens in chat and I don't notice, just tell me. I'd much rather have this be vocal.
Yeah, we'll read chat for you.
Yeah.
And forward on questions.
Okay. Behavior-driven development and robot framework. Here's my basic idea. Occasionally I get, people have gone into a lot of discussions about BDD, and there's a great deal of confusion around what BDD actually is, and certainly my understanding of what BDD is changed from the time when I got introduced to it in 2012 by my buddy Larry Apke to the time now when I've been doing it fairly reliably for the last several years, and the feel for what it's about, what it means, what matters and what doesn't has changed a lot. And I figured that a little presentation on the topic of what actually matters in BDD and what are kind of fluff topics that everybody talks about a lot that don't actually matter in the BDD business, but which still consume a large portion of the discussion. I think having an awareness of which parts of that matter is worthwhile. Secondarily, come 2017 or so, I went into an organization, I said, hey, let's do BDD. They said, cool. I said, hey, let's try using the standard technologies, Cucumber or whatever. And they said, you know, we don't really like that one. We're using something else for our test automation. I said, what is it? And they said Robot Framework, and I used it for a little bit, and it is so much cleaner, easier, nicer to use than the other competing technologies that I'm familiar with, that I figured I have tended to pair discussions of BDD and Robot Framework together because they fit very, very nicely. That said, one of the first things, the first half of this presentation is going to be arguing that you don't even really need the Robot Framework part to do BDD well, but we can use it. So that's where I'm starting. Let's go ahead and move forward. Oh, I don't know how to do this. Part 1, BDD. So here's our problem. Sorry. Right. I met Tom in 2012, and in 2012, the most common words out of his mouth was, "Well, that's crap." And I figured I'd go ahead and just go along with that. Our problem is that fundamentally, passing information from person 1 to person 2 by documents, and then person 2 building new documents and passing it to person 3, and person 3 building new documents and passing it to person 4. What's the famous term? It ends up as strong fertilizer, right? It's not an effective way of doing things. The central problem in requirements gathering is the fact that passing documents is a very poor way to let the people building and testing the code figure out what we're actually trying to do. Whether that be the analyst talks to the customer, then the analyst talks to the developer, and then the developer sends a spec to the tester that may or may not be the same spec that the analyst developed, and then that comes out. Or we have this theoretical Scrum magic where something happens and a product owner gets information, and then the product owner passes information to the developer and again to the tester. It doesn't matter how we pass documents. It doesn't matter what steps we have in document passing. If you have document passing as your method of handling requirements, you lose, right? You produce something that someone might call a smell, not a code smell though. That was highly unfortunate. I'm sorry. I'm having my headset is low on battery and it decided to turn off somehow, even though it's nominally plugged in. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so the center of the solution, and this is really simple and it's kind of crazy. The center of the solution and the 90% value proposition for BDD is, instead of entertaining handoff mechanism. I mean, you can see like the football handoff where you hand it off to 3 different guys on the way and now everybody's confused. Instead of that, we get some people in a room and we have a conversation. And if you wanted exactly one thing to take away from BDD, the line is, if you are going to build something, you must have a conversation that has development representation, testing representation, and product representation in the same, today it's virtual, but in the same room, having a conversation in real time about what we actually want to do. This is traditionally referred to as the 3-legged stool, or occasionally the 3 amigos of BDD. And perhaps we also want to include UX if you have a UX team or person or something, right? But the center of BDD's solution is we do not pass documents to figure out what's going to happen. We get the people in the room and we have the conversation with developers, testers, and products, so that the product person can say, hey, I want a dynamically populating field here that repopulates every few seconds and it updates everything. And the developer can say, you know, that's going to cost us like 50 hours to do. Whereas in 15 minutes, I could do a simple field that has stable data. Is it really worth the delta between 15 minutes and 50 hours to have that thing that you're asking for? And most of the time, the answer is no for some of the things that the developer will be concerned about. Some of the times it's yes, but having one directional conversation there is silly. Having a tester to say, hey, yes, this is something we can check, and this is something we can't really check is also important to the conversation, right? So the center of BDD's solution is you have a conversation in a room with at least a developer, somebody representing test, and product-focused folks so that we can get clarity on what we're building. Unfortunately, that's not a saleable item, right? Hey, you have to actually have a conversation. You can't name that something. Conversation-driven development doesn't really work. So we have tricks. The trick is that we're going to have a test, right? The real thing BDD is about the conversation between the developer, tester, product, and UX people. The trick we use to make this a nameable method that we can sell is we build a test, right? And we structure the conversation around the test rather than having a free-form conversation. This is a trick. It's a good trick. It's a valuable trick. Unstructured conversations don't get us as good of information most of the time as structured conversations, and a huge chunk of what we need to do when doing development is we need to say, hey, how are we going to know if it's done? Right? Software, when you build software, saying build this is great, but saying build this and here's how we can tell if it's done really finishes a good chunk of the conversation. If product comes in and says, here's what I want, and then we get a good conversation, and what comes out of the conversation is, here's how I can tell if we're done, then you're pretty much winning in terms of doing software development if the product people are able to figure out what's actually needed, right? I'm not pretending that we have the ability to figure out what's needed without talking to customers, but the conversation point between the people who are going to build it, the people who are going to check it, and the people who are asking for it in the first place, that needs to happen. And structuring the conversation around a test is a huge win. But it's the trick, it's the gimmick, it's how we get the conversation to happen. It's not even the important part. Once again, and I'm going to say this like 20 times, the conversation is what BDD is about. Everything else is secondary. Now, that's what BDD is. If you go talk to people who aren't me, they will want to go in and talk about a whole bunch of other things about BDD. They will want to talk about what tools you can use. They will want to talk about the history of BDD. Hey, theoretically, BDD comes from a blend of TDD and DDD, domain-driven design, right? And that's where the history comes from, and here's how it comes from both. Yeah, whatever, right? That's not actually what's important about BDD. What tools are you going to use? Hey, I use Cucumber. I use RSpec. I use SpecFlow. Yeah, fine. That's nice, right? I don't care about that either, right? If you're having the conversation, this matters. If you're not having the conversation, that's bad and all the rest of the stuff put together isn't going to help you with the real problem we're trying to solve. There's a third piece, which is the Gherkin format. Everybody gets super excited about the Gherkin format. The Gherkin format is a way of writing tests in a fairly specific fashion. Everybody likes given, when, then, because that's the standard Gherkin syntax. However, in practice, that doesn't matter either, right? I mean, it's a way to describe what everybody in testing knows about testing, in that when you do a test, you do some setup, and then you do something to say, what does this do? And then you check what it did. I mean, that's important. But the fact that we're calling it given, when, then is mostly, again, fluff on top of the actual important thing, which I know I repeat myself, the conversation between the people who need to figure out what's going to get done. And so I usually, I'll tolerate given, when, then. Some of the tools require given, when, then. Some of them don't. Being aware that you should set up your tests in arrange, act, assert is not news to anybody who's ever done testing. So I'm not really surprised by that. The last topic in details that don't matter very much is timing. When should you do this? The generic position that I use to describe, hey, when should you do this, is the lean theory that says, look, every time you delay making a decision, you get more information. And so, essentially, you should make decisions only at the last responsible moment. If you make a decision that you don't have to make, that it doesn't cost you anything to postpone, you have made a worse decision than you would if you made the decision later. Sometimes it is worth paying the costs to make the decision now, even though you would make a better decision later. It's fine. I'm not saying don't make any decisions. I'm saying that over time, as time progresses, we collect information. The more information, the better decision we can make. That means that by default, we should lean towards late decisions rather than early decisions. Make the decision, in the famous lean words, at the last responsible moment. From my point of view, and have sorry about that. From my point of view, and having done a lot of BDD across the last 8 years, last responsible moment means at the point at which a team is ready to pick up a story, right? After stories have moved into your sprint, and when we are getting ready to pick up the story to do it, then we bring product, we bring test, and we bring dev into the room, and we sit down and we confirm what test we're actually going to run to check to see if this thing is what we needed, right? That is the last responsible moment. If your product people are less available, then your last responsible moment may be earlier than that, right? If you can only get your product people to show up once a week, then do this when the product people are there, because having the conversation is what matters, right? But in the event of having a choice, making the decision at the last responsible moment is a really wise choice, because it means you're not locking yourself into decisions that could change later, right? And might change. I think a lot of Agile is not locking yourselves into decisions based on incomplete information today. That is the way it's practiced most of the time. A lot of people don't focus on the last responsible moment when discussing BDD, I think it's useful. So one more time. What's important in BDD?
Conversation.
The conversation. You get the people in the room and you have the conversation. That's what matters. And pretty much all of the other pieces of BDD are nice to have, good for trainers to have something to talk about, right? And not really that important. Okay, I want to pause there because that's the first half of my presentation. It was once a BDD in 2 minutes discussion, but I actually had time to talk about it this time. So before we move on, or Helene, Tom, Greg, tell me if that's not the structure you want. Do we have anything to ask about BDD per se?
I'm checking the chats. I don't see any questions at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question.
Great.
Thank you, first of all, bringing up the conversation. But for my past experiences, but when you said document, when you said the documentation, you were talking about the serial documentation, someone documenting. And I thought of another example, the kindergarten circle or the telephone circle in kindergarten class.
It's a telephone game.
Yeah, and so it's a written telephone game. And it's just that I just wanted to get some clarification. But you want to document your decisions. You just want to have the conversation drive what it is you're going to document, and that you all have the same understanding of what's documented.
So I like that answer to about 3/4. Yes, you want to have the conversation. Having documented what happened in the conversation is important, but one of the things that I've spent when I talk about user stories, so what problem is are user stories trying to solve? Well, they're trying to solve a similar problem. Communication is a two-directional thing. If I send you a message and I get nothing in response, there has not been communication, right?
Yeah.
Straight up communication diagrams, Claude Shannon, all that fun stuff, right? Communication includes the message and the response, and with no response, we don't have communication.
Yeah.
I've also spent a lot of time in the last decade on mental models. I say something, you hear something. What I say and what you hear don't line up perfectly, right? Your brain does a lot of work filling in what I said.
Yeah, that reminds me of another individual in our field that is doing something called clean language.
I met the clean language people through Tom after a while. I got to that approach through education constructivism, but it's a very similar model, the constructivist education and the clean language people. So yes, that. You have a model, you have your words, we have mostly shared words, plus we have different mental models, right? How do you coordinate the mental model? The answer is there has to be a lot of back and forth or it doesn't actually go, right? So once again, we're in a place where the Agile story is a fundamental dispute of the notion that we can center ourselves around a document. We have to center ourselves around a conversation, and the document can exist to remind us of the conversation. But relying on the document as primary can't happen. And that's the biggest, what's the biggest words in story writing right now? A story is a placeholder for a conversation, right? That's what everybody likes to say, right? And it's the most important thing that's said about stories. It's a placeholder for the conversation. To a significant extent, the BDD thing is a structuring of the conversation.
That part is very intriguing, the structure. Yeah.
Right? And
and I like what you were saying, Kyle, about that and to me, that was a genius point, that if you're going to have this conversation about the story, why not structure it around how you're going to test it? And this is where, and I think as you might ease into it, even using that the given, when, then as part of the conversation, clean language tools, right? Given this situation, when, then, and to sort of use that as a guiding force. And whether you actually use the Gherkin language or not in the explore chest, it's just giving you the words to try to help guide that.
Yeah.
And I thought genius is to help really folks walk their way through that and make it happen.
Yeah, I think BDD is brilliant, right? Like, really, it is. Nobody I know who's been doing BDD for 5 years actually cares about the parts that I ignored in my presentation, right? They care. No. Are we having this conversation? Have we produced a common understanding of what we're trying to build, right? We wrote it down in the form of a test because that's probably the best way to confirm our common understanding. But that's the end of what BDD cares about. A lot of people will then do BDD and say, oh, by the way, I'm going to take this language and I'm going to write automated testing under it. In practice, the more time you spend in BDD, the less you care about the automated test that happens afterwards.
That you need to convince some of us on.
Okay.
Right? Because I think the automated test is what really helped you stay on top of the speed of development. That the more you can automate.
Automated testing is great, but end-to-end automated testing almost universally stinks, right? End-to-end automated testing is not where you want your testing effort to be, right? You really want your testing effort to be at the unit test level primarily, at the API test level some, right? But the test pyramid, test automation is great, but I'm sure we could spend the next 3 hours listening to Tom talk about how his automated testing background, if we have unit test, that covers almost everything you actually need, and we don't actually have bugs.
If you know how to do OO correctly, which most people don't.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, so you're separating that out. So you're saying if you have really good unit test, API test coverage that run as automated tests themselves, you don't need end-to-end automation per se.
The end-to-end automation. So I tend to be a giant. My obsession overall in Agile and software generically is total cost of ownership. How much does it cost you to make the next change?
Yeah.
And end-to-end testing is atrociously bad on total cost of ownership, right? If you make any reasonable change to your user interface, then you have to change all of your automated tests. And that is so bad for total cost of ownership that we really don't like automated end-to-end tests. We like some to confirm that it's roughly doing what you want. But the real value of the automated end-to-end tests is, does my stuff hang together? All of the deep testing that you really want to do should be at the unit test level. And I mean, at some point, even the BDD people got into that, saying, hey, we're going to write these BDD tests, but behind the BDD test, we're not even going to do an end-to-end test. We're going to do a unit test. Hey, when I set the customer's salary and give them a raise, you can't give them more than a 10% raise, right? That's the kind of thing that you would do in BDD. But the new version of BDD that I've been seeing since, I don't know, 17, 18, they're pushing, hey, yes, but I don't have to write that as a web test. I can write that as a unit test in the code with a BDD front on it. So again, the end-to-end test is nice to have, right? But a lot of us, the more time we spend in this, the more we talk about, hey, which are the most important end-to-end tests? Because I'm going to get rid of the rest of them. Actively deleting end-to-end tests.
I,
automate your unit test.
yeah, I got another thought that comes to mind. First off, thank you about clarifying documentation. So essentially, testing is the documentation, agreed upon testing.
Yeah. Hey, I can define, here's what it's supposed to do. We can write it down. And just so we're on the same page, am I here? Here, I'll do this. That's what a test looks like.
From the robot framework.
I mean, honestly, any of them do. It doesn't matter whether in Cucumber or Robot or RSpec or SpecFlow. The tests all look like this. This happens to be Robot, but none of them actually look different from this, right? There's mild spacing topics, but that's
thank
about.
you for clarifying that.
Right.
I got a confession. I myself, I spend my time in the hardware world, materials world. So,
okay. Yeah. Again, I would bet that you want to do most of your tests on subcomponents, not a run through the whole system.
Oh, that leads to the other question. My other comment I thought of is that what we're talking about, though, when we're systems, we're not talking about embedded systems or deterministic systems. We're talking about applications that people use, like desktop applications or mobile, or items like that.
So most of Agile comes out of the consumer web world, but there are certainly those of us. 3 months ago, my primary focus was teaching this stuff around embedded systems in C++.
In that case, I've heard the argument that you would want to favor integrated testing versus unit testing, and that you may miss something.
So here's, I'm going to push. There are 2 theories of testing, 3 or 4 theories of testing. Test theory number 1 is that your test exists to catch everything. Alternate theory, your test exists to push the total cost of checking that you would otherwise do manually down. The integration tests tend to be decent, but more expensive to change, right? You have to, every time you make a change to what you're doing, your integration test gets more expensive. Now, the pace of change in the hardware, the pace of change in the firmware, the pace of change in the drivers is somewhat lower than what we see. And so you may find that your calculus for where does the cost of change get pushed gets easier. Like, you can handle more integration tests in a world where the code isn't changing as much. But the more code changes, the fewer end-to-end tests you want, because every time you change anything, then you have to change all of your integration tests, and that's atrociously bad for total cost of ownership.
Oh, it is costly.
Right? So the question starts to become, well, doing the manual test once or even 10 times is frequently cheaper than writing the automated test. Right? So now you have to actually take seriously the economics and go, okay, I'm balancing total cost of ownership changes. How cheap is it to make the changes in all of my automated tests versus how cheap it is, how expensive is it to do manual testing for these things that keep changing? And I think it's really important to pay attention to, just, if you think, hey, we're trying to minimize total cost of ownership, and you pay attention to the rate of change, you get somewhere.
Yeah. So, that's good. But I like to.
Let's move on to the robot framework piece now.
Yep.
Okay. So, really quick.
One question, Kyle, is the example that you were showing there of your test actually in Robot Framework?
Yes, it is. So here, part 2, Robot Framework. right? You'll note, Helene, that I did start off with your WallE picture. So, right, we actually watched WallE at our house in the last week and a half. So,
Thank
again,
you. Excellent.
For the 7th time.
I may have a herd of kids that some of them haven't seen all of the shows. So, here's what Robot Framework looks like. This is actually a Robot Framework file. So historically, you know how we do web testing? We do this. All right. This is historical web testing in the Selenium version, in the Java version of Selenium. Selenium, somewhere around 2005, was built to replace the Mercury testing framework because Selenium, of course, is the element you use to fix mercury poisoning. And that's how it got named. You write. Selenium is a client-server testing model where we have the Selenium API, and then you have language calls to Selenium from pick a language. If you have a favorite language, we probably have a Selenium interface into that language. My historical patterns in language have been Java-centric, and so this is the Java interface into the Selenium underlying system. But really what's going on is I have the Chrome driver set up, and then what I'm doing here is I'm making calls to the Chrome driver, and the Chrome driver is making calls to the Chrome browser, right? And that's how Selenium generically works. This is the Java version. And if you were going to do a test in Selenium, you would probably write something that looks like this. This worked once, but Google changes their pages and Selenium changes their pages. So I don't always have this in working condition. The same test written in Robot looks like this. For what it's worth, this is what your BDD conversation should produce. It should produce a document that says, hey, here's my test case. I have one test case, and here is what it does. Here's setup. When I do this, and I do this, then this happens. Given, when, then structure. Can you make it more complicated? Yes. Robot is actually a fully functional Python program sitting under the covers. So you can do quite a bit with this. But this is the structure of what you want to do. For a different client recently, somebody's got a background noise going on, I think.
I'll look for it.
So we build something like this. So you know what's super cool about the Robot Framework? This is language independent. The given, when, and then is completely optional. You can delete them to zero effect, right? They're just fluff to support you while you're learning how to structure language stuff. But Robot Framework is essentially a programming language. This is a function call. Robot Framework's single interesting technical trick. I think maybe we have Donna's background. Donna may have background noise going on. Oh, thank you. Robot Framework single trick is, they said, a single space is not the end of an identifier. It takes two spaces to make an identifier end. So open browser to Google, if you were writing it in any other language, it would be open browser to Google, which sounds awfully program-like. But if you built a language where a single space doesn't constitute a separator, then open browser to Google is simply a function name. And you've specified a function name. I personally think this is brilliant, and it's the most readable thing I have ever seen in software. Hey, what are we going to do? We're going to open the browser to Google. Then we're going to search for, hey, do you see two spaces? That means I'm passing an argument to my function. Then I'm going to search for Selenium. Then I'm going to click through to the Selenium link. That's a function. Then Selenium page is going to be open. That's a function too. At the end, whether it succeeded or not, we're going to close the browser. Okay, come on, Kyle. That can't be the whole thing. No, it can't. But if this is what you're produced by the conversation, this is actually a manual test case. Right? You have confirmed what you're supposed to do, and you're going to be able to check this at the end of do whatever you do with your story. So this is really powerful. Guess what else is true about this? This is not attached to any language, browser or otherwise. This is simply a claim of what we've done. I've written this for C++ programs that will run in an embedded system. Right? I happen to have written a test case for a manual. Avnish points out that we're calling these scenarios or terminology scenarios, but yeah, I produced this. It's in pure English with a language support behind the pure English. And the most important thing is 3/4 of the time I stop here. I'm done. I don't actually have to go beyond this because I've written a successful test case in conversation with my product people, my test people, and my dev people. Right? And this is a tremendously useful document. If you happen to want to, then we can jump behind the scenes. Hey, look, I've got a linked list of functions somewhere. And my linked list of functions says, what did I say here? Oh, yeah, I'll do that. I have open browser to Google. Great, let's define the open browser Google function. Right? If you've ever written code before, I don't know how you can have a hard time reading this. Open browser to Google means step 1 is open the browser. Open browser is a function that comes from the Selenium library. If you care, here's Robot Framework. Here's a list of libraries. Here's the Selenium library.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
Here are, come on. Here's my documentation of the Selenium library. There's my keywords, right? And here's all the things you can do. What did I say? I said open browser. Here's the arguments you pass in. Here's a bunch of examples, right? We have pretty solid API docs on this. And this happens to be the Selenium library. You can just as well do this for file system behavior. And I have, but I don't have that example sitting in front of me. So open browser, which is a function that's defined in the documentation, spaces to indicate that it's an argument. It takes 2 arguments, where to open it and what browser to use. The browser is Chrome. The URL is Google. Second step, maximize the browser window. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's clear what it means. Third step, set Selenium speed. The single biggest problem with automated testing in browsers is the test says do this and the browser lags. So we set up a Selenium speed to say don't do steps too fast. And then I have a confirmation step. Google should be open, which is a function which I defined right here, which calls the Selenium function, and I passed in a variable. This wasn't a variable I set up here. I just passed it in straight instead of defining it as a constant above. When search for, okay, search for says, search for is a function. The function takes arguments. The argument will be called search term. So what that means is Selenium is being passed into search term. It's a straight up function call with really English-like syntax. Input text into the Google search field, and here's the value. Selenium's moderately friendly. Robot is super friendly. When you say input text into the Google search field, that Google search field will look for the name or the text or the ID or a class path or an X path, or I mean, pick something. Anything that it could search for, it will search for, right? And so it's very nice. Again, click button, the button text, click through to the Selenium link, says click the link, and then the page should be open. I'm going to check this, which is a test, and I'm going to check this, which is a test. Oh, right, we should run it. Look, Ma, no hands. The reason I use Robot Framework is because it's absurdly easy. If you can spell code, you can write this, right? I mean, really, there's nothing here, right? And it happens to sit on top of Python. It happens to have really solid documentation. When I'm doing file system stuff, then I use operating system and built-in and stuff rather than the Selenium library. And I check that the file was created, and I check that this is there, and I run a system command, and all of that is available. This works completely independent of domain. If you can access it via a computer, we probably have a library that lets us access it. And if we don't, we at least have the operating system level stuff where you can say, write this on the command line. And even if you don't have that, we have Python, which lets us write our own libraries.
So Kyle, can I interject?
Yeah, please.
I have a comment, and it's based on something that you said. First of all, I never realized that's how Selenium got its name, that it was to be the cure for mercury poisoning. But it really resonated with me because as in my past career as being a project manager for large corporations back in the day when Mercury, test runner, was the thing that everyone used, I suffered. Developers and the poor testers who were writing the Mercury tests and working in that structure. But it leads me to the question. So back when we were using Mercury load runner and the test structures, those were QA people, right? Those were people who were not developers.
Mm-hmm.
They were folks who could just get into Mercury load runner and have some like scripting knowledge and use their tools to write tests.
Mm-hmm.
In Selenium, in what I'm seeing here with like Selenium, maybe in your robot framework, right now I still feel like there's a little bit of coding, because when we talk about adding libraries and making sure we have everything hooked up, It feels more like coding, but can you speak to, do you feel if you use Robot Framework, we are back to allowing QA, quality assurance team members to write these tests, and we're not reliant on developers to have to write all the tests?
So my first line is, you can't tell me that QA can't write that. You just can't say that because I've actually taught this to a bunch of QA folks and even product folks who aren't QA centric, and shown them, hey, look, we can do this. Yes, there's some config. If you have an admin locked machine,
Right.
I have no idea if it's open source, but it's free to use. There's libraries you can write your own. You can probably drop your own into. Yes, it is open source, Shenthil. So that's a huge thing. Second, look at the documentation. Shenthil likes a different framework. He likes this one, but I don't know that one, and I grew up with Selenium. So you have this library. Come on, I got lost. Right, here's my keyword documentation. Right, you just have to look here, and it's in English. It's not like there's any code. You don't have to know syntax. Most of the time, the tests you're doing are not doing looping or anything. You don't even have to structure your tests, right? It's, hey, here's a test case, and here's the things that it does. And so first we write in English, and then we write in almost English.
So I know everyone likes to create everything new from the ground up, but what you have on the left is what we called scenarios through all of the 90s, and we used to write those in order to understand what our requirements were going to be.
Absolutely. And so this is a scenario, and we have a fancy name for it, and now it's an executable scenario instead of a, right? And executable scenarios, I don't know how you win past that.
Kyle, I do write the test cases, but without this given, when, and then. I mean, I don't use that.
I don't use given, when, then either. Just somebody reminded me that I was talking about BDD, so I snuck them in there. Sorry, I interrupted you. Please go on with what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, so I always felt that this given, when, and then is kind of some rules I have to put it. I mean, so I don't use it directly. I use open browser, so everyone understand that, okay, it is the given and it is the when, and
so
yeah.
The reason given, when, then got structured is because it was built halfway between product people and test people and devs. And a lot of devs don't actually understand that you should generically arrange your tests in an arrange, act, assert approach. Right? And so given, then, when is just another way to say arrange, act, assert. And the early BDD tools forced it onto you. Robot doesn't. Robot.
But that's not actually essential in Robot Framework, those keywords.
Robot Framework, and as Shenthil was pointing out, this is actually what my tests look like.
Oh, nice.
Mine too, yeah.
Right? But they said, oh yeah, somebody's going to want to use BDD for this, and some of those BDD people are crazy about given, when, then. So, hey, let's put those as invisible words.
I could see using them at the beginning when you're training people, and then
absolutely, and that's exactly what I do that for.
Yeah.
And I want to give a small intro on the browser library and.
Can we hold on that for a minute? If we want to talk about that after end, I just want to make sure we get this. I believe you, and I'm actually interested. It's just I've been using Selenium for so long, I happen to do this. But the coolest thing for me is, did you notice there is zero language specificity in here? There's nothing. It is purely a scenario that you can, but don't have to turn into an executable thing.
Well, so we spent the 90s just having that conversation, calling those scenarios, and we didn't turn it into an executable. And we found it was really helpful for writing software. So it was really nice for you to rediscover what we all developed 25 years ago.
That's the cycle of life, Tom.
I'm just trying to point out that what everybody who's done BDD long enough says is, no, look, you don't actually need most of what we do, right? The BDD thing really is you have the conversation and you don't pass a document. You have the conversation and you build this scenario together.
Nice. No, it's wonderful. Thank
So
you.
I wanted to take a moment and be respectful of time. So I'm sorry, Kyle, this is great stuff. And it sounds like you're willing to stay on for a little bit longer. But it is 1 minute of the hour. And for those who have tight time schedules, who have meetings you need to get to, or in some cases, people might actually want to go to dinner. If you're Shenthil, I know you're out many hours ahead of us. I did want to spend one moment on a couple of administrivia things. This is being recorded, and I will make the recording available to everyone in a public place in the coming days. So keep your eyes on your email from both the Agile groupies and Daytona Devs meetup groups. I wanted to put a slight plug in for, we will have another, we have another Agile Groupies coach retreat scheduled for January 9th of 2021. This is our annual coach retreat event. Instead of it being in person, which we typically do here in Michigan, USA, it will be virtual. And it won't be a full day. We're planning on just something like a half-day event. You will be seeing postings on that coming, but it's a Saturday. We'll have multiple speakers, all to help raise your coaching game, a place to come and learn and share coaching techniques. Coaching, whether you are coaching Agile, software development, traditional development, if you're a developer, you're a coach, you're working with teams, you are probably coaching in some way or another.
And we do have a clean language speaker as well.
And we've got clean language. That
Judy Reese, who wrote the first book on it. So.
Yeah. So that's coming in January. And for those who are interested in this kind of great discussions and to be able to keep that going, I'm going to put a post in our chat box. We have, as part of our A2 Agile, there it is behind me, company, we run a monthly Agile discussion group that's just open to anyone, and it's totally free. I put a link to a little sign up for it if you're interested, where we cover everything Agile, Scrum, Lean, Kanban discussions. We have great discussions, and it's meant to kind of help people continue on with this kind of open event where we've got questions coming in. We each help answer one another. Tom and I are on that call every month to help you with your Agile and Lean, Scrum, Kanban adoptions. So that's it for my plugs of what's coming up. As I said, Agile Groupies will have more meetings. I'm always looking for other speakers. My goal would be wonderful if we could have a December meetup. I'm not quite sure. We don't have anyone scheduled just yet. But we do have the January Coach Retreat, which is January 9th. Keep your eye posted on both the Agile Groupies and Daytona Devs meetup. I will have it posted on there as soon as we get that scheduled and get the everything, the schedule formatted.
And the coach retreat is virtual and going to be a bigger size. Normally we did small, like 20 people was the cap, and it was in person.
Yeah.
So I think we're having 2 speakers from Europe.
Yep, one from California. So we've got folks from around the country.
So we're leveraging our virtual world.
Yeah. So for those who need to go, we will let you go. Kyle, if you're willing to stay on for another, like maybe 5
for sure.
minutes. I don't want to keep everyone too long, but we'll let folks go. And thank you for joining us at our meetup this month.
Feel free to post additional questions.
Yes. Feel free to use the chat, or just kind of, if you're hanging on. All right. Anyone have questions?
What's on the screen, I think, is this is how you install that stuff, right? It's really tricky, except it's not. right? That's actually all the steps. And step 4, Shenthil does differently than I do because he uses a different library. Right? If you're not admin locked, this takes like 2 minutes. If you are admin locked, it may take several days.
If you're working at a big company, it may be 3 months.
You know how that goes, right?
Yeah.
And you say you have taught this to quality assurance personnel. So
I've
have
taught it
taught
to
people-
quality assurance. I've taught it to product with no technical background at all.
To the extent you're teaching it and you're keeping them on that left-hand column, there's no reason why you can't. You're teaching a little bit of structured formal vocabulary for them. They'll get it really quickly.
Yep. It's super, yeah. I mean, there's nothing here, right? Hey, if you're passing a variable into a repeatable call, then you put 2 spaces. That's it. Okay, that's the end of the structure discussion. Right? You define your term on the left and then you indent for the steps. I mean, I guess you have to say that, but.
And then you can show them what are your standard terms that people use all the time.
Yeah, hey, look, we have an existing library over here that actually has a bunch of things you can do.
Yep.
But please don't start doing this stuff without paying attention to the fact that what matters is this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's where your comment earlier, Kyle, on the conversation, let the test, how you want to structure the test, guide the conversation. So if BDD is all about the conversation, and then the conversation can all be structured around how are we going to test this thing? How do we know it's working for us?
Yeah, and that
document them.
But that's the giant thing. If you distill BDD down, it's like no, you can't go off and write the tests. We have to talk about what it should actually do. And that's like 90% of the value proposition of BDD. We have to talk about what we're going to do, and we're going to have we're going to be done with our conversation when we know how we're going to test it, either manually or in an automated fashion, right? And sure, you can write this part yourself. Sorry, I just lost it. You can write that. You can, hey, tester's going to go off and write that. Okay, that's legit. But that's after we've agreed on what the test is.
Or developer.
Yeah, that too. Don't care. Pair tester and developer.
Maybe we could begin to eliminate some of these roles.
Well, and this gets to something we've been talking about for years now in Agile. That is, we like the tests written before the code is written. And if BDD is all about the conversation and testers are at that conversation, they're able to write that basic test structure early on before you have the code. Yes, they'll need the code if they're going to write the end-to-end testing, if they're really doing user interface, checking the browser, and are the buttons in the right places. But I like your point that that's doing full automated end-to-end testing is really hard. Because for all the reasons we've been hearing for all the over the last decade from QA is that things keep changing on us. So we can't, every time you change the color of a screen or the location of a button, they got to, the test breaks and they have to rewrite it. So you're really advocating get closer to what you have there in the robot framework at the test level, at the unit test level, at the API level. Automate that as much as you can. And then what's left that you might have to do more manually or a little more labor intensive in formatting the end-to-end tests is not as arduous.
So Kyle, when you're teaching a team, are you having them do automated unit testing as well?
I
TDD?
Generally keep that separate. I think of TDD as primarily a design technique, not a testing technique.
Right.
Right.
So they're doing that, but this is what they're doing.
This is how the test and product people interface with. Hey,
Right.
what is our system supposed to do? And some of these tests will end up being written under as a unit test rather than as a
Right.
end-to-end test. But yes, this is the interface into what should we do. TDD is so that my code is good.
So while we have Shenthil still here, Shenthil, your bosses, you said your bosses were having trouble wanting to do this. What is the issue you're running into?
Yeah, I mean, so the issue is like, so they already started working on the Cucumber and they put a lot of effort on the Cucumber. So they don't want to get rid of that and move to Robot Framework. They also use the BDD. But one thing I make them very impressive is the browser library. The Selenium library uses the WebDriver to interact with the browser, but the browser library directly interacts with the browser through the browser API. So that is why the browser library always very fast and also never fails. And you don't have to use something like keywords like wait for the element or something. You don't have to use because it automatically waits for it. Yeah, it's the code is really nice. The keywords are really better than Selenium.
So
thank you for sharing, Shenthil.
This is one thing I gave them a demo of. It runs really fast, and then they are really impressive. And now they want to come to Robot Framework, but still not fully convinced. But this browser library made them convinced. Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. When I'm selling this, I'm selling it for readability. Cucumber takes more setup, and Robot Framework, it's the amount of setup is, I already showed you, it's 0, and you already know that, right?
The readability strikes me as the huge win. And if you drop off even those keywords,
then it's just English.
Then you have that. So I remember when
what was I looking?
We were having these conversations at USAA 8 years ago. And what was fun was when we were first doing that, they were, the business was able to fully participate in writing the scenarios for each story, and that they love doing that.
Robot Framework has more setup, and it's structurally a little bit more forced and has more, you have to learn you have to learn Cucumber, right? That's the biggest thing for me, is to do Cucumber, you have to learn it. To do Robot, you get a dev to write 3 or 4 lines or even copy a couple lines into the top and look, hey, let's write a test case. Hey, let's write another test case. There's no, the win if I'm selling this is not tech. It's how easy is it for the business to get into this stuff?
It's the conversation. And I think what we missed a little bit during the 90s when we did this is too often we had the analysts going off and writing these by themselves as opposed to doing it as a team.
Yep.
So let's kick off all of, for this use case, let's get the team together and kick off these 10 scenarios.
Yeah.
In the next 20 minutes, and we're done, and we don't have to look at them again.
Yes. And you can do it as you're picking up a group of stories.
Yeah.
Hey,
so if there's a new win that really came in here, it's this slide and that piece of them. In your and I vocabulary, no, this is a ceremony.
It's absolutely a ceremony, and everybody I've ever seen do this does it as a ceremony.
Yeah.
So
you're pointing out, which I hadn't fully made the connection, that it's also clean language is just fascinating, or whoever pointed that out. So it's like, oh yeah, it is.
That was Greg, I think.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to add, the Cucumber, the people working on the Cucumber, it's a developer. They are not the testers. And now the reason, if I introduce the Robot Framework and if it is really easier, and the developer is a bit worried that, okay, if it is really easy and the tester will take over and I will not have a job. That's the problem.
Oh,
days.
well, that's a different story.
I'm shocked, Shenthil, because usually I heard the opposite, that the developers were upset that they had to write all these tests. That means they couldn't spend time writing
Yeah,
or putting more.
I think I
code.
think a lot of times people know every 100-person project has a 10-person project struggling to get out, and a lot of people are aware of the fact that we're way overstaffing things.
That said, this is something testers can write, and one of the dangers with Cucumber is always
Cucumber looked horrible. Looked like
yeah,
code.
well, it was Selenium, and in general, Cucumber is just hooks into Selenium.
Yeah.
Right? You have some syntax before the Selenium that says, hey, this unit test or this tool using some automated testing framework, which is probably Selenium, will be attached to this framing. Right? And it's really devs doing automated testing, whereas what you see here is completely testers doing automated testing, or even just let the product people at it, they can do it.
Yeah, especially the left-hand side.
Well, the left-hand side is, yes. The danger is the product people will want to do it themselves, and they won't do the conversation that we have to have.
Yeah, we have to have the conversation.
And what ID is this?
This is Atom, right? It's a plain, boring, stupid text.
And if you use PyCharm and it's really nice colors, and it will differentiate for example, that when search for Selenium, it's a different colors. But now I thought it's the same line. When search for Selenium, I thought same line.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, hey, text editor, yes, turn on colors for Robot Framework syntax, right? And I mean, it's mostly it knows given, when, then, and it knows resource and documentation. It knows that if it's shaped like this, it will color it differently so you can tell it's a constant.
Cool. Well, thank you, Kyle.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from folks while we're here? All right. I guess we are there. Kyle, I want to thank you so much for spending an hour and a quarter of your time walking us through this. Clearly, it was very well received.
I think it's fun, and I think it's a giant win. And I think when you go get training on this, everybody talks about the complex parts, not the important parts.
Yeah. So this was really insightful. I'll get the recording out in the coming days. I'll try to trim down some of the early chat that we had before the meeting actually started and get something out for folks. So thanks everyone for coming. Kyle, again, thank you so much. This was really insightful. I hope you will be willing to do this again on other topics.
If you want me to talk about something, Tom knows it's hard to get me to shut up.
That's okay. We've got 3 of us to try to corral you if we need to. All right.
Bye.
We're going to end the meeting for now. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.